So as I mentioned since last time, I'm going to go over one of the main types of biases. First one is ignoring evidence, which is confirmation bias. Um, Basically, you don't believe everything you hear. Selective evidence is if influenced heavily by feelings and belief, and selective information and memory is used in processing this information. And another one is failing to accurately judge a source credibility. So like we often trust people who are associated with more expertise in the field. And then misunderstanding or not using your statistics or going with your gut is another type of bias. Failing to accurately apply statistics to interpret events around them. Seeing relationships that do not exist is another type of bias, like making something out of nothings. For example, making patterns out of clouds. So because our human minds have a desire to find patterns out of coincidences, leading to superstitions. We also use relative comparisons. Information that comes first has often has a strong influence on how people make a relative um, how tend to information that comes first are usually has a strong influence on how people make comparisons or judgments. And people also tend to prefer information that's presented rather positively rather than negatively. And accepting after the fact explanations. So attempting to offer an explanation after a fact has been given is another type of bias that we use. Often coming up with explanations for why events happen, even though they have incomplete information, or also known as hindsight bias. Um, there's this one example I read in textbook about the 2012 school shooter. So this is a school shooter. There were no warning signs that he was about to shoot up the school. But after he shot up the school, they later found out that he was always a trouble kid. But we couldn't predict that earlier because we're not good at predicting. We're often better at giving explanations after uh, evidence has been created. So this is just one of the examples. And taking mental shortcuts, keeping it simple is another type of bias. We often follow simple rules and create mental shortcuts using heuristics, useful for producing reasonably good decisions without too much effort. Failing to see our own inadequacies is a self-serving bias. And this is about how everyone is better than how people everyone thinks that they are better than average in a certain field. People often believe that they are better than average, in other words, overconfidence. One of the examples is in driving. Most drivers believe that they are better than the average, but that cannot be true because 50% of the drivers, around 50% of the drivers would be average drivers. But more than 50% of those drivers say that they are above average. And we also often credit personal strengths for success and outside forces for failure. So that's for chapter 1.1. I'm going to move on to the how psychology that has originated from philosophy. Okay, I'm going to talk about the foundations of psychology. So from understanding the human nature, we can tell that psychology has originated from philosophy, and I'm going to talk about the basic foundations of the history of psychology. So, one is the nature versus nurture debate, and dating back since ancient Greece, where Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato debated whether an individual's psychology is an attribute belonging more towards nature or nurture. So, psychological characters are both biologically innate and acquired through education, experience, and culture. Another foundation was the mind slash body problem. Throughout history, there has been skeptical information around the relationship between the mind and the body. The mind has been viewed to be residing in different other organs of the body. Ancient Egyptians, for example, they often believed that the heart was valued more and it was valued and portrayed with more importance compared to the rest of the body, in belief that it would be weighed in the afterlife to determine a person's fate. Eventually, over the years, Greeks and Romans recognized further that the brain was essential for mental function, mostly due to through observations made during brain injuries. Nonetheless, scholars continued to believe that the mind was separate and in control of the body. This theory was still held partly because of the belief that there is a concept of an immortal soul that separates us humans from other animals. Around 1500, the famous artist Leonardo da Vinci dissected human bodies to make more accurate anatomical drawings of the brain. His theory consisted the fact that all sensory messages like vision, touch, and smell arrive at one location called the sensus communis, which may have been the root of the new modern word common sense. He believed to be the home of the thought of judgment. Now, although his conclusions were not accurate, his work represented an early and important attempt to link the brain's anatomy to its psychological functions. Later, in 1600s, philosopher named René Descartes promoted the influential theory of dualism. Now, dualism is a term that refers the idea that the mind and the body are separate yet intertwined. Now, he describes the body as an more like an organic machine. I would go more in detail about dualism, but I'm still reading upon it. And so far, I found out that modern day I'm going to end the fact that dualism in modern day psychologists they reject the idea of dualism. And yeah, that concludes my presentation for today. And I will pick up from where I dropped today next week.
Thank you, Saadath. One thing I would add about Rene Descartes and his dualism,
Mm-hmm.
um, he's definitely not the first person to think that the soul is something different than the body or that it's special. But he's often like cited as the important guy in the history of philosophy and ideas for this, right? Um, but people in religion have thought this for a very long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, this is also the textbook's a little bit wrong there in saying that modern psychologists reject dualism. A lot of them accept it, especially if they're like a Christian or religious in any way.
Uh-huh.
Uh, in fact, uh, I'm sure just about everyone in this group is a dualist themselves, even though they have a decent understanding of science or health.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and the nature versus nurture debate. Yes, that's an ancient debate. It's very interesting. And it continues to this day that people study the roles of nature and nurture, or, genes
Right.
and basic biology versus what is learned, right, and changes in
Mm-hmm.
response to the environment. But also an important new field of study is the nature-nurture interaction. How do your genes and predispositions interact with learning experiences and exposures to environmental stimuli? Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Saadath?
What was that thing? Can you repeat that part of everyone thinking they're above average? What is that thing
Okay.
called?
This was in bias. This was in 1.1. I'm just going to go back to it. So this is a type of bias. Let me see. This one's about
Is it
everyone.
self-serving
Yeah,
bias?
it's failing to see our own inaccurate. Yeah, self-serving bias. That's the one. So
That's actually a very like commonly cited fact as like it just kind of it's a fun fact.
yeah, I don't know where the research is. I don't know where the research is made. Yeah, but it's written here that like
It makes
it's
sense though. It
it's
completely makes
stated
sense
that
if you think
people
about it.
often believe that they're better. And one of the examples was driving. I don't know if
Yeah.
other examples apply to this. I'm not sure, but in driving, like you can see it displayed.
People like on positive traits, if the person's like, you know, quote like psychologically healthy or normal, they
Mhm,
usually rate themselves as higher than average, right? And the
mhm,
problem is that one, not everyone can be better than average, right? Only
mhm,
50% of people can be better than average.
mhm,
Uh, and two, psychologists now like they know this. They know people typically rate themselves better on positive traits, and they rate themselves as less negative on negative ones. Usually, it depends on their self-esteem, right? So if
mhm,
they have higher self-esteem, they rate themselves more favorably, and if they have
mhm.
negative, you know, usually more negatively. And so psychologists try to like if they make surveys, they try to use very neutral wording, as neutral as possible, if they're trying to get at a more objective rating of something.
Mhm.
But
See, I can like understand how some like we may feel overconfident in some fields, but it's not like I don't feel like I overrate myself in all fields. Like suppose if I'm not good at something, like I don't think